Hello and welcome to SoulSpeak. Tonight, we step into the quiet suburbs of Oregon, a place that once seemed safe, peaceful, ordinary, but behind one tidy little house, evil was quietly breathing. His name was Jerry Brudos, a husband, a father, a man who fixed wires by day and built nightmares by night. Between 1968 and 1969, young women began to vanish without a trace. Their cars were found neatly parked, doors locked, no signs of struggle. Days later, their bodies surfaced in the cold waters of the Willamette River, bound by cords, weighted down by car parts, stripped of their dignity. When detectives finally broke into Brudos's basement, what they found went far beyond murder. It was a private museum of horror, rows of women's shoes, stolen lingerie, and photographs of lifeless bodies posed like broken dolls. He wasn't a stranger hiding in the dark. He was the friendly neighbor next door, polite, smiling, and utterly monstrous. Tonight, we uncover the chilling story of the Shoe Fetish Slayer, a man whose obsession with beauty spiraled into an addiction to death. It was January 26, 1968. The rain in Portland, Oregon, fell hard and cold, blurring the city in a wash of gray. For most it was just another miserable winter day, but for 19-year-old Linda Slauson, it was another long shift trying to sell encyclopedias door to door. She was tired, soaked, and hungry, but she needed just one more sale, enough to pay her rent and maybe buy herself something new. She checked her small notepad for the address of a potential client, though the ink had smudged in the rain. Then she saw him standing by his driveway, tall, clean-cut, and smiling warmly. His name was Jerry Brudos, a local electrician. He looked harmless, friendly even. When he invited her inside to talk about the encyclopedias, Linda accepted without hesitation. Jerry mentioned that his family was upstairs and suggested they go down to his basement workshop where they could talk quietly. The basement was tidy, organized rows of tools neatly arranged, the smell of oil and damp concrete hanging in the air. Linda sat on a stool, opened her case, and began her practiced sales pitch. Jerry stood beside her, listening politely. Then, without warning, he lifted a wooden plank and struck her in the back of the head. The sound was sharp, heavy. She fell instantly, stunned but still breathing. He knelt beside her, wrapped his hands around her throat, and squeezed until the room fell silent. When it was over, Jerry took a long, steady breath. Upstairs, his wife and children were still in the house. Calmly, he went up and gave his wife money, telling her to take the kids out for dinner. Once the door closed and the house was quiet again, he returned to the basement and stood over Linda's body. For years he had dreamed of this moment, not the killing itself, but the control. The stillness, the chance to possess something beautiful completely, without resistance. He undressed her carefully, then dressed her again in stolen clothing from his secret collection. He posed her body as if she were a mannequin and took photographs. To him, it wasn't murder. It was art, a dark, forbidden ritual that finally satisfied the obsession he'd carried since childhood. That obsession had started long before this night. When he was just a boy, a pair of women's high-heeled shoes had fascinated him. And when his mother caught him trying them on, she punished him brutally, calling him wicked. From that moment, desire and shame became tangled in his mind. As an adult, that fascination grew into compulsion, and compulsion turned into something monstrous. Now, standing in the basement, Jerry Brudos had crossed a line he would never return from. Later that night, he loaded Linda's body into his car, drove to the Willamette River, tied her to a heavy car engine, and pushed her into the dark water. Back home, he opened his freezer and placed one of her severed feet inside a high-heeled shoe, his most precious trophy. Then he went to bed as if nothing had happened. In the months that followed, more young women would vanish. Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, Linda Sale, all drawn in by the same calm, polite man. Police would later uncover his hidden world, boxes of women's shoes, lingerie, photographs, and the haunting evidence of what he had done in that basement. To his neighbors, he had always been quiet, reliable, the man who fixed their lights and waved from his yard. But behind that ordinary smile lived one of the most disturbing minds America would ever know, the Shoe Fetish Slayer. And as we step into his story, one question lingers in the shadows. What drives a man to murder? For a pair of shoes? Jerry Brudos's story did not begin with murder. It began in a house where small humiliations and strange rewards shaped a boy's picture of himself and of women. Born in 1939 in Webster, South Dakota, he grew up wanting a mother's approval he would never fully get. His parents already had a son, and his mother's disappointment in him was plain. She favored his brother and openly criticized Jerry, scolding him for the smallest things. Those early messages, rejection, shame, the sense that he was unwanted, lodged deep and would later twist into something far darker. One formative incident stands out in the record and in Brudos's own retelling, the discovery of a discarded pair of women's high-heeled shoes. As a child he was fascinated by them. When his mother caught him with the shoes, she responded not with curiosity or calm correction but with fury. She beat him and, in front of him, burned the shoes. That single act, the combination of attraction and violent repudiation, created the template for a pattern that repeats in many sexual offenders. An object of desire made forbidden, then sanctified in the mind by its prohibition. In Brudos's case, desire and shame fused. The heels were no longer just shoes, they were a forbidden key to feeling powerful in a life that had taught him powerlessness. Adolescence did not moderate his urges, it amplified them. He began stealing women's clothing and shoes from neighbors and peers, hiding them in his room and wearing them in private. These acts were not merely erotic, they were rehearsals of control. The garments allowed him to inhabit a different role, one in which he determined the script. When others discovered his behavior, he was punished or ridiculed, which reinforced the secrecy and the intensity of his compulsion. At the same time, he developed fantasies of holding a woman captive, of reversing the humiliations he had absorbed as a child by making another person utterly dependent and powerless. By his late teens, his fantasies had already yielded violent enactment. Reports from the period describe early assaults, break-ins where he would lie in wait, attacks where he took shoes and underwear as trophies. A pattern emerges: the theft of items, the wearing of them in private, the escalation toward forced encounters and photographic documentation. Those photos served two functions for him: evidence of possession and a way to freeze a moment of absolute control. This progression from fetish to criminality is critical to understand. The fetish provided the initial focus. Compulsion made it recurrent. Control converted recurrence into ritualized violence. Psychologists and practitioners who later examined Brudos's case would point to several interacting elements that turned private deviance into public danger. The first is attachment damage. Sustained emotional rejection in childhood eroded basic empathic responses and facilitated objectification of others. The second is the eroticization of domination, the merging of sexual arousal with acts of control and humiliation. In Brudos's mind, killing was not solely about ending a life. It was the ultimate assertion of possession. A body could be posed, photographed, and mutilated in ways that no living person could resist, thereby achieving a perverse completion of the fetish. FBI profilers such as John Douglas and Robert Ressler, who were pioneering the behavioral analysis of violent offenders, would later classify offenders like Brudos under the rubric of lust murderers. Their work emphasized that such killers are driven by sexual fantasy that culminates in homicide. The act of killing becomes a climax to an elaborate mental script. Douglas and Ressler argued that to predict and apprehend such offenders, investigators needed to understand the sequence: fantasy, escalation, rehearsal, and then the physical act, and to look for tangible signs of that sequence in the offender's life. Thefts, voyeurism, pornography, and a trove of souvenirs. Brudos's early behaviors fit that template. The thefts and secret cross-dressing were not isolated paraphilia, they were preparatory acts. Each stolen shoe or undergarment was both a trophy and a prop for a fantasy that required enactment. The move from stealing to staging, from staging to photographing, and from photographing to killing represents the classic pathway of escalation. When the fantasy can no longer be satisfied by substitution, it demands reality, and reality in Brudos's case required domination, so total that escape and survival for the victim were impossible. Importantly, this psychological arc also explains his composure later in life. Those who met him described a calm, methodical man. That facade of normalcy is not evidence of an absence of pathology. Rather, it is the accompaniment of ritualized behavior. Routine and careful planning reduce risk and permit repetition. The basement workshop, immaculate, organized, a hobbyist's paradise, functioned as both stage and laboratory. There, private compulsion was exercised with precision. There, fetish objects accumulated into a collection that memorialized his crimes and kept the fantasies alive between killings. Understanding Brudos's roots does not excuse him, it contextualizes him. The combination of early emotional injury, a fetish rendered sacred by prohibition, and a steady pattern of escalating behaviors produced a predator who transformed intimacy into annihilation. In profiling terms, he is a classic study, not a mindless brute, but a man whose inner life was governed by sequences of desire, rehearsal and domination, a lust killer whose violence was tragically and terrifyingly logical to himself. Linda Slauson, January 26, 1968. Linda Slauson was 19, cold from the rain, and doing what countless young people did then, selling encyclopedias door to door to make ends meet. Brudos's selection process began with proximity and opportunity. He targeted women who were isolated for a short time, who carried themselves in ways that matched the visual triggers of his fetish. A particular posture, shoes that caught his eye, or simply the vulnerability of a stranger at a doorstep. He presented himself as harmless, polite, slightly shy, a neighborly man who wanted to help. The interaction with Linda followed that script precisely. By inviting her to the basement under the pretense of privacy and convenience, he exploited social norms people tend to accept. Minor invitations from strangers when the cost seems low and the context ordinary. In the basement, the setting was controlled, fluorescent light, tools neatly arranged, the hum of machines, an environment that both concealed violence from the house above and reinforced the roles Brudos wanted to play. The assault itself, as he later described in clinical detail to detectives, was swift and methodical. A knockout blow to prevent resistance, followed by strangulation to ensure death. Post-mortem, his actions moved from killing to possession. He undressed her, dressed her in garments from his stash, posed and photographed her, then took trophies, the most notorious being the severed foot preserved in a shoe and hidden in his freezer. That particular mutilation, while grotesque, was consistent with his psychological logic. The shoe was not merely clothing but a sacred object in his internal economy, and attaching it to a preserved body part symbolically fused the fetish object with the literal possession of the woman. From an investigative standpoint, Linda's case illustrated several signature behaviors that would later be recognized. Across Brudos's crimes, staging of the body as display, collection of trophies, and meticulous attempts to conceal remains by weighting them and dumping them in the river. The selection, the quick execution, and the ritualized aftercare form a pattern that combined sexual fantasy with operational planning, a lethal combination that moved him from deviant collector to serial killer. Jan Whitney, late 1968. The killing of Jan Whitney showed both continuity and escalation. Jan's disappearance followed a different variation of the same approach, an initial offer of help and the promise of a fix, this time tied to a car breakdown and the commonplace compassion people show motorists in trouble. Brudos presented himself as someone with tools and the ability to help. He used that plausible story to transport her to his garage and place her in a situation where isolation and his control were absolute. The mechanics of the killing were similar: deception, isolation, and strangulation, but the aftermath demonstrated a more elaborate staging and a colder composure. He kept Jan in the garage using the pulley system he had installed to suspend and pose bodies, which indicates premeditation and the physical apparatus for repeated behaviors. He photographed her extensively, both clothed and unclothed, documenting the victim as if curating a gallery of trophies. Crucially, he attempted to create molds of body parts, a further sign of objectification that went beyond simply owning or photographing. He attempted to manufacture relics, to capture the victim's physicality in a permanent, manipulable form. When a car later smashed into the garage and police briefly shone lights into the space, they missed evidence that was right in front of them, a hanging body obscured by dust and debris. This near miss demonstrates another trait of Brudos's offending. He was not careful in a way that suggested panic. Instead, his operations were conducted within a routine that assumed a low risk of exposure because he relied on his ordinariness and the community's blind spots. After disposing of Jan's body in the Willamette, he continued to use photos and trophies to replay the event privately. Psychologically, Jan's case underscores the repetitive nature of his compulsion. Each murder was both an end and a rehearsal, intended to sustain the fantasy until it demanded another fulfillment. Karen Sprinker, March 1969. Karen's abduction at a department store parking lot is notable for how brazen and opportunistic Brudos could be when his fetish was triggered by sight alone. He followed her because of an outfit and shoes that matched his preference, approached with a weapon, and forced her into his station wagon. The choice of a public, populated setting demonstrates a calculated risk-taking by acting in daylight, near others. He minimized the kinds of prevent suspicion that would arise from hanging around a victim's home. Once inside his control, the pattern again unfolded: threats with a gun, forced posing, sexual assault, photography, and ultimately strangulation. But the treatment of Karen's body also revealed the limits of his planning. He tried to create molds of breasts, a grotesque attempt to hold a material piece of her anatomy. When those molds failed, he left fragments and trophies that inevitably increased the physical evidence trail linking him to her. The photographs of Karen, some showing her alive in terror, others post-mortem, became a crucial piece of investigative linkage once police found them in his possessions. For the investigative timeline, Karen's case provided forensic corroboration of a suspect profile, the presence of specific shoe types, the use of particular knots and automobile engine parts for weighting, and the reuse of electrical wire variants that matched materials found on body. Behaviorally, Karen's murder fits the pattern of escalation punctuated by improvisation. Brudos had an internal script, but when the physical act required adaptation or when a trophy could not be manufactured to his satisfaction, he left behind more incriminating residue. That residue, photos, clothing, and unique methods of binding, formed the connective tissue that detectives would later use to stitch together a serial pattern. Linda Selle, April 1969. The final confirmed victim in the timeline that brought Brudos to justice. Linda Salle's case combined many elements already seen but also served as the pivot toward discovery. The abduction and murder followed the now established modus operandi, an approach in a public space, a plausible lie or show of authority, forced transport to a private workshop, assault, posing, and strangulation. However, the recovery of bodies in the Willamette and the discovery of matching knots, copper wiring, and engine parts began to produce a pattern that was no longer isolated incidents but a serial signature. In Linda Salle's case, forensic details were clearer and more immediately linkable. The oversized bra stuffed with paper towels, the presence of similar mutilations, and the way her remains were weighted mirrored previous victims. Investigators, now working with two recovered bodies, could employ comparative pathology and trace evidence in ways previously unavailable. They examined the knots and wire twists, spoke to neighbors and acquaintances, and cross-referenced descriptions of a tall, freckled man driving a station wagon with children's clothes inside. The escalating number of victims, combined with the accumulation of physical evidence and eyewitness accounts, narrowed the investigative focus until it converged on Jerry Brudos. The analysis of pattern here matters. Brudos's repeat behaviors, lure, isolate, control, pose, and preserve trophies, created a signature that was both his psychological satisfaction and his investigative Achilles heel. Each repetition increased the odds of error or exposure, and by the time Linda Salle's case was under scrutiny, the mosaic of evidence had become large enough to expose the man who had thought himself invisible. Across these four murders, the common threads are unmistakable. Brudos selected victims through visual cues and situational opportunity, used deception or feigned authority to isolate them, relied on physical force to secure control, and then enacted a post-mortem ritual that combined photography, trophy-taking, and sometimes mutilation. Psychologically, the crimes reveal a man for whom control and possession were eroticized to the point where life itself became an object to be owned. Operationally, he blended ordinary domestic roles with carefully constructed private spaces, the basement as studio, the garage as stage, enabling repeated offenses. Investigative success ultimately hinged on recognizing these repeating markers, the same knots, the same wiring, the same kinds of trophies. Those markers turned a string of disappearances into a solvable pattern, allowing law enforcement to move from tragedy to arrest. It began, for investigators, as a string of unsettling coincidences that slowly stitched themselves into a pattern. Women in and around Salem and Portland vanished over the course of a year. Their cars were often found parked where they were last seen, doors locked, items untouched. That lack of forced entry or theft troubled detectives. These were not robberies gone wrong. The contrast between an intact scene and a missing person suggested a perpetrator who used deception and authority rather than brute force to create opportunities. As bodies started to appear in the Willamette River, each weighted with a heavy car part and bound in similar fashion, the links became too many to ignore. The river recoveries provided the first hard physical evidence: nylon cords with distinctive knots, copper wiring twisted in a particular manner, and traces of binding methods that hinted at someone with practical, hands-on experience. Forensic detail concentrated the investigation. Pathologists established cause of death as strangulation in multiple cases and documented specific post-mortem treatments, posing, photographs, and in several instances, mutilation. The presence of copper wire and twisted electrical conductors on some bodies drew a direct line to occupations that routinely handled such materials. Detectives noted that the wiring had been manipulated in ways consistent with someone comfortable with splicing and coiling, small but telling signs that narrowed the field from a faceless predator to someone with a technical trade. Around the same time, spotty eyewitness accounts began to surface. A number of witnesses described seeing a tall, freckled man in a dirty station wagon, sometimes with children's clothing visible in the back. In one case, a young woman reported a phone call from a man claiming to be a Vietnam veteran asking for a blind date. Another student who did agree to meet him later reported feeling uneasy because he casually spoke about the river bodies and asked if she worried about being strangled. Those disparate observations, when taken together, outlined not only a physical description but also behavioral quirks. A man who talked about the killings as if they were abstract curiosities. A man with access to a station wagon and a family life that provided cover. Investigators Jim Stovall and Gene Doherty among them responded by building a connective strategy rather than relying on one big break. They canvassed neighborhoods and junkyards, questioned mechanics about engine parts that matched the weights used on the bodies, and ran down reports of suspicious phone calls to sorority houses and dorms. They paid attention to the knots. Nylon cord tied in a distinctive way became as informative as a fingerprint. Copper wire with a particular twist was treated as trace evidence. As the web of circumstantial and forensic hints thickened, detectives pursued the lead of a man who matched the freckled description and drove a station wagon. The breakthrough came when a student who had been targeted agreed to a monitored meeting with the caller. Police staked out the rendezvous and, within days, found the man they needed to question, Jerry Brudos. The arrest was not a dramatic chase, but the result of methodical police work. When Stovall and Doherty confronted Brudos, he answered questions with a calm that would later haunt those who interrogated him. He provided a name and an address, initially a false one, but detectives unearthed a trail, previous reports of violence or attempted theft, neighborhood accounts placing him near certain disappearances, and circumstantial ties to the areas where victims had last been seen. With probable cause building, Stovall and Doherty secured a search warrant and entered the Brudos property. What they found in his garage and workshop turned a string of suspicions into near irrefutable proof. Boxes of women's shoes, lingerie, photographs of young women, some alive, some dressed as if posed after death, and a coil of copper wire matching the strand found on one of the recovered victims. There were engine parts and nylon cords consistent with those used to weigh bodies, and a list of phone numbers for sorority houses and dorms. The tableau was chillingly coherent, objects and patterns aligning with the forensic profile the detectives had painstakingly assembled. Interrogation followed. Brudos's demeanor during questioning was striking for its lack of apparent remorse. He spoke in clinical, detached language about what he had done, often offering precise descriptions of clothing and position, as if cataloging items in an inventory. On more than one occasion he described his acts with an unsettling pride. To him these details were trophies, not crimes. Psychologists and interrogators noted that his calm was not mere composure but part of how he maintained control emotionally and narratively over the events he had engineered. His confessions were detailed enough to confirm modes of operation and post-mortem behavior investigators had only theorized about, which closed evidentiary gaps and connected him to specific victims. The investigative success in the Brudos case illustrates several features of 1960s-era detective work that mattered: attention to pattern and detail, persistent canvassing of human witnesses, careful preservation and comparison of physical traces, and the strategic use of a decoy to draw a suspect into exposure. It also exposed limits of the timeless sophisticated forensic labs, and slower evidence processing made the detectives' fieldwork and perceptive interviewing even more critical. Ultimately, the combination of community reports, technical forensic matches, wiring, knots, engine parts, and the palpable physical evidence found in Brudos's workshop produced a converging case that transformed a series of disappearances into a solvable homicide investigation. What began as scattered, alarming incidents had become a coherent narrative leading to a man who could no longer hide behind an ordinary suburban life. When Jerry Brudos was finally arrested, the moment lacked drama, no chase, no resistance. Surrounded by evidence from his own garage, he simply surrendered. Inside the interrogation room, detectives expected denial or panic. Instead, they met stillness. Brudos described his crimes in measured, emotionless sentences, recounting each murder like a technical report. He corrected officers on small details, offered times, locations, and even his reasons for preserving certain trophies. That detached precision shocked investigators. It revealed not only memory, but pride. To Brudos, these acts were accomplishments, rituals perfected, not sins to regret. His calmness was not innocence but control. Even in captivity, he sought to own the narrative. When the case reached court in 1969, his defense team faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming: photographs, trophies, forensic matches, and his own confession. The only strategy left was to claim insanity. They argued that Jerry Brudos was not responsible because his actions stemmed from severe psychological damage and uncontrollable sexual compulsions. To test this claim, both sides brought in psychiatrists. Over weeks of examination, 7 experts interviewed Brudos, reviewed his history, and analyzed his behavior. Their verdict was unanimous: he was mentally disturbed, yes, exhibiting clear antisocial personality disorder and deep sexual fetishes, but he was not insane by legal standards. He understood right from wrong. He planned, lured, concealed, and confessed with full awareness. As hearings began, Oregon's courtrooms filled with reporters, the public's fascination mixed with disgust. Newspapers called him the Shoe Fetish Slayer, and families who had once greeted him at church or in the grocery store now sat in horror as police described his crimes. The details, the photographs, the mutilation, the trophies dominated headlines. Parents locked their doors earlier, women stopped walking alone, and Oregon's image of quiet safety was shattered. For a state known for its calm suburbs and community warmth, the idea that such evil had lived among them was unthinkable. Public anger grew fierce. Some called for the death penalty, others demanded psychiatric confinement for life. But legally, the insanity claim was collapsing. 2 days before his trial was set to begin, facing mountains of evidence and no credible defense, Brudos pled guilty to 3 counts of murder. The plea shocked many, not because of remorse, but because of its timing. He had realized the insanity plea would fail, and a guilty plea might spare him the death penalty. The judge, unmoved by his flat demeanor, sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms. The language of the sentencing was blunt: society must be protected from a man who kills for pleasure. No possibility of parole. Reporters noted how Brudos listened without expression, eyes half lowered, as if the verdict belonged to someone else. Psychiatrists later agreed on the core diagnosis: antisocial personality disorder, coupled with a sexual sadism and fetishistic compulsion. He lacked empathy, used manipulation as a tool, and treated human life as an extension of his fantasies. Yet he remained fully conscious of his crimes. FBI profilers, including John Douglas and Robert Ressler, later cited Brudos as a textbook example of a lust killer, an offender who merges sexual gratification with total domination. For Oregon, his conviction was both relief and revelation, a reminder that monsters don't always hide in darkness. Sometimes they mow their lawns, wave to neighbors, and live behind white picket fences. The trial's aftermath left scars beyond the courtroom. The families of the victims faced years of grief. The local community carried the shame of proximity. Media outlets turned the case into a national conversation about deviance, misogyny, and the limits of mental health intervention. Brudos's crimes became a case study in criminal psychology programs and FBI behavioral analysis training. Decades later, his name would resurface in documentaries and textbooks, not as a mystery, but as a warning. He had been ordinary, predictable, and polite. That was what made him terrifying. When Jerry Brudos was sentenced in 1969, few could have predicted that his crimes would later become foundational to how America studies and understands serial killers. At that time, there was no behavioral science unit at the FBI, no criminal profiling program, and little scientific framework for understanding sexual homicide. Detectives relied on instinct and pattern recognition rather than psychology. The Brudos case, with its cold ritualism, sexual motivation, and symbolic trophies, would later become one of the early blueprints for the newly formed FBI Behavioral Science Unit in the 1970s. Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, pioneers of behavioral profiling, analyzed Brudos's case in depth during their research for myths. They identified him as a quintessential lust murderer, a killer who merges sexual gratification with total domination, deriving excitement not just from killing but from the control, the posing, and the post-mortem rituals that sustain the fantasy long after death. In training sessions at Quantico, Brudos's psychological trajectory from childhood fetish to organized sexual homicide became a model used to teach new agents how fantasy and ritual feed one another in offenders who kill for pleasure rather than necessity. The taxonomy of serial murderers. Lust killers are distinct from other offenders because their crimes are deeply rooted in sexual compulsion and psychological ritual. Jerry Brudos embodied that archetype long before the term existed. Unlike opportunistic or rage-driven killers, he operated with calm deliberation. Each murder was prescripted in his mind, performed to satisfy a private fantasy, and repeated to recapture the sensation of absolute control. His acts of posing, photographing, and collecting trophies served to extend the moment indefinitely. Each object became a bridge back to the thrill. FBI profiler John Douglas later wrote that lust killers externalize their fantasies through murder to achieve an intimacy they cannot experience emotionally, a process Brudos demonstrated with eerie precision. His fetish for shoes and clothing wasn't a superficial quirk but the gateway to complete objectification. The victim became a mannequin, a canvas for reenacting a fantasy of beauty and dominance that had begun in childhood shame. What made Brudos's crimes particularly significant for behavioral science was their clarity. The step-by-step transformation of fetish into compulsion, and compulsion into homicide. In psychological terms, his behavior traced the full spectrum of escalation, providing researchers a rare comprehensible case study. The horror of Jerry Brudos's story extended far beyond Oregon's borders. In 1983, crime author Ann Rule published Lust Killer, a detailed reconstruction of the case based on police files, interviews, and psychological analysis. The book became a bestseller, cementing Brudos's title as the Shoe Fetish Slayer and introducing millions of readers to the mind of a sexual sadist. It also influenced a wave of true crime storytelling that sought to balance horror with understanding. His case would later inspire television portrayals, documentaries, and even fictional characters from procedural shows like Criminal Minds and Mindhunter to film antagonists shaped around the duality of the ordinary man and the hidden predator. These portrayals reflected a cultural fascination with how evil could live quietly within normal life. For many viewers, Brudos represented the archetype of the suburban monster, not the drifter or stranger, but the neighbor with a polite smile, a steady job, and a nightmare in his basement. His crimes also accelerated discussions about media responsibility and voyeurism. Journalists and filmmakers grappled with the ethics of depicting such horror without sensationalizing it. In later years, criminologists compared Brudos to other serial offenders whose crimes revolved around control and fetishistic obsession. Ted Bundy, for example, shared Brudos's charm and intelligence but was motivated more by narcissism and predatory dominance than by fetish. Jeffrey Dahmer, on the other hand, demonstrated similar necrophilic tendencies and a desire to physically possess his victims. Yet Dahmer's compulsion stemmed from loneliness and abandonment rather than sexual fetishism. Brudos differed in one crucial respect: his emotional detachment. While Bundy sought admiration and Dahmer sought companionship, Brudos sought control. His emotional register was flat, the absence of empathy, fear, or guilt replaced by mechanical fascination. He didn't kill to destroy but to preserve. He treated death as a still life, tableau where the body became an object of art. Extreme form of objectification made him one of the first American killers to demonstrate what psychologists now term sexualized fetishistic homicide, the reduction of a human being to a collection of parts, serving a fantasy. The comparative analysis placed him at the beginning of a psychological lineage later traced through other organized lust murderers, shaping FBI typologies for decades. What made Brudos particularly dangerous wasn't his violence alone, but his composure, his capacity to blend into normalcy while nurturing fantasies of domination. He was methodical, calculating, and emotionally hollow. Psychiatrists noted that his affect during interviews was so subdued it bordered on robotic. He recalled killings with the same tone one might use to describe fixing a light fixture. This emotional flatness, a hallmark of antisocial personality disorder, allowed him to commit atrocities without cognitive dissonance. Unlike impulsive killers who are betrayed by rage or panic, Brudos's crimes were organized, planned, and rehearsed. That combination of intelligence, patience, and lack of empathy made him a prototype for what the FBI later called an organized lust murderer. He maintained family life, employment, and public composure while compartmentalizing his secret world of violence. In profiling terms, he was the embodiment of duality, the neighbor you trust, and the predator you'd never suspect. More than 50 years later, Jerry Brudos's case continues to be studied in law enforcement academies and psychology departments as a reminder of how fantasy can metastasize into action when unchecked. His life underscores a core principle in behavioral criminology, that deviant behavior rarely appears overnight. It evolves through rehearsal, secrecy, and reinforcement. Every photograph he took, every shoe he collected, was both symptom and rehearsal. Understanding that trajectory helped behavioral profilers recognize early warning signs in later offenders and refine risk assessments for sexually motivated violence. Beyond criminology, his case forced American culture to confront the fragility of normalcy, that monsters may not roar in the dark, but whisper from across the white picket fence. Time, as it always does, dulled the noise of headlines, but not the pain that lingered behind them. Jerry Brudos spent the rest of his life inside the Oregon State Penitentiary, a sterile, gray world of routine and consequence. For more than 3 decades, he remained largely unchanged, cold, detached, and indifferent to the enormity of what he had done. In 2006, at the age of 67, he died of natural causes while serving his consecutive life sentences. When a reporter once asked if he felt remorse for the women he killed, Brudos's answer was as chilling as his crimes: "I care as much as for that piece of paper." There was no reflection, number apology, only the hollow echo of a man whose humanity had long since decayed. For the families of Linda Sl, Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Seller, his death brought little comfort. Many had waited decades, hoping for answers or even a moment of contrition that never came. Some found relief only in the knowledge that he could never hurt anyone again. Others said that his death closed a chapter but did not end the story. The pain of loss remained, passed down through generations. A quiet reminder of how one person's obsession had shattered so many lives. In the years since, criminologists, journalists, and artists have continued to revisit the Brudos case, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. His story has become a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting uncomfortable truths about desire, control, and the thin line between fascination and horror. Through studying him, investigators learn to recognize the patterns that might stop another predator before he kills again. Through remembering his victims, the public honors the lives stolen by a man who mistook possession for love. And so the story closes where it began. In the quiet suburbs of Oregon, where an ordinary man hid extraordinary darkness, evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles from the doorstep. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. How do we define justice when evil wears a human face? Where, in the fragile space between desire and conscience, does a person stop being human? Leave a comment, share this story, and keep the conversation alive, because understanding darkness is the first step toward stopping it.